Jeff Hancock is the Harriet Norman Chandler Professor of Communication at Stanford University, founding director of the Stanford Social Media Lab, and co-director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. He is also a senior fellow at the FSI. He is a leading expert in social media behavior and computational social science. He has begun work on understanding the mental models people have about algorithms in social media, as well as working on the ethical issues related to computational social science. He is also founding editor of the Journal of Trust and Safety. For the audience, if you have any questions, please post your questions at the chat during the talk. Okay. With that, please.
Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate that. And excited to talk with everybody. I'm sorry this is virtual. Would have loved to have come down and visited, but hopefully we can do that next time. I'm not going to spend too much time setting things up here about what AI is, because I know this group is quite familiar. And if you're like us up here at Stanford, you could almost play a bingo game to see how long a conversation goes until the word AI is used. And that makes it exciting because we can do all these kinds of tasks that we typically have done on our own. And so here would be me introducing myself if I had to do that. ChatGPT does a pretty good job, actually fairly accurate. But what I want to focus on and remind us all is that these systems, and here I'm going to be referring to generative AI produced by large language models, do a whole host of things, including not only generating, but also they're incredibly good at classifying and understanding human communication. And that's what I've been really struck by over the last several years, is how good it is at analyzing human communication and then using that as part of communication. And what I'm particularly interested in is when AI sits between us. So when AI is using those capabilities, analysis, generation, in the service of facilitating human-to-human communication. And we started thinking about this about 6 or 7 years ago when smart replies came out and started to be used extensively, that, you know, I could be clicking on a button which would write a sentence for me, and AI was being inserted into, you know, billions of email messages a day. What were the consequences, and how did it influence the way we communicate with one another? And so we called this AI-mediated communication. And the definition that we've provided for this, and I have some papers on this and a definitional paper that I'm happy to share if people are interested. We define AI-mediated communication as interpersonal communication that's optimized, augmented, or even generated by algorithms, because we were writing this before the GPT revolution. And this is used to achieve specific communicative or relational outcomes. So really, we think about, you know, here people are interacting with one another. They always have goals. They're always trying to accomplish things, take a very functional and social purpose approach to communication. And AI now is being used to accomplish some of those things. And so today, what I'm going to focus on a lot is, you know, our work in this space. And in particular, one of the areas that we're interested in, how AI sitting between humans affects trust. So we've been focusing a lot on this question of, does the fact that AI sits between people have an impact on how we trust one another? So our definition for trust is going to be this one by Nicholas Luhmann, which I like. It's very simple, adaptable to lots of contexts. Trust is the confidence in one's expectations. And I like it because there's this notion about trust where we can never really know what the future will bring. We can never know exactly what someone else will do, but we do have expectations, and those expectations vary in our confidence. And so that's what we're going to be using as we go forward. GPT-4 did a pretty good job this morning when I asked it. This answer was different from the last time I asked it. So it's been one of the interesting things also is thinking about temporal validity of the kind of research that I'm about to show you today. So if people have questions about, what exact model, what the exact data was, please let me know. They're in the papers, but that's a real challenge for the space that we're sort of working in here is the rapidity in which things are changing. Okay, I'm going to start with us just digging into a core human cognitive phenomena in which we make decisions about other people. So this here is a peacock, and peacock has these amazing feathers. And those of you that know anything about evolution or evolutionary biology knows that these feathers are beautiful, not because the bird is trying to be beautiful, but he's trying to attract a peahen. Peahen actually doesn't care at all about the beauty of these feathers. The peahen is attracted to these feathers because they're an indicator that this peacock has excellent genes, that it has strength, and it has access to resources, because these feathers are reflecting that genetic component. They also attract predators to it, so it has to be strong enough to defend itself given these feathers, and it has to have access to enough calories to support these insanely beautiful but ridiculous flowers. So the peahen is using these feathers and this display as a signal of some underlying trait about the peacock that it can't observe, right? So the peahen is making this sort of inference about something that's really important to it, but can't be actually observed. And we do this as humans all the time. We rely on signals that convey some key social information that we then use to decide whether we're going to trust somebody to hire them, to date them, to allow them to stay in our home as an Airbnb guest without murdering us, for example. So these aren't trivial things that we have to judge people on. When we're hiring them, this is often a very expensive thing if we screw up. Romantic partners, when we go on an online date, that's very expensive from a time and emotional energy, et cetera, et cetera. And we're doing this sort of like inferencing all the time. So in the online job example, we're having to make a decision based on, say, a resume or what somebody says about themselves, but whether they will actually be a good employee with the relevant skill set. So we're inferring from the circle there something that we can observe. We're inferring that underlying trait. So two things that we typically infer about other people really quickly, in the same way that the peahen does with the peacock, is competence and honesty. Work across cultures and over a long period of time has shown that within a second or so, we make a judgment about other people, whether they seem like they're capable or not, and then whether or not they seem friendly or a foe. And this is probably related to evolutionary pressures, being able to judge other entities really fast to decide whether this other person is going to be somebody that is going to help or hurt us, and whether they're capable of doing that. And so when I show you these two guys here, everybody that's watching and taking a look at these has already made a decision about which one they would trust more. Unlike some of the other things I'll show you about trying to decide, something was generated by AI or a human, here, everybody in the room will likely agree which one is most trustworthy. So let's get everybody right now to put into the chat box the letter associated with a person they think is more trustworthy. So if you think A is more trustworthy, throw A into the chat box. If you think B is more trustworthy, throw B in. Great. We're seeing people responding really fast. Indeed, your brains have already made this decision. You're sort of like writing down what your brain already decided a long time ago. And as we're seeing here, everybody is throwing in B. If I were to give this talk to about 100 people, about 97 to 98 people would say B. And there are a couple of people that would say A. And there is just some diversity in opinion that's related to some other individual differences. But what's really fascinating is we all made the same decision roughly, and it's this B person. And what's really, really cool is there is no actual person. These were generated by colleague Alex Todorov at Princeton. And we're making these judgments based on faces that don't exist, but we can feel it. We know it. We know that this person is or is not trustworthy. And you can probably guess what all the features are, but the upturned mouth, the softer face, the lower eyebrows, and the less prominent forehead. And there's arguments as to why this is the case related to Homo sapiens mating with, but also killing off Neanderthals. But we do this kind of work all the time where we take a signal that we can observe and make these inferences about things that we care about from a trust point of view. So very common human phenomena. We're really skilled at doing it. We have really long time evolving cognitive systems to do this work for us. And what happens when we move online? Well, we take these really old cognitive systems. We take a look at people, we'll look at the photo a little bit, we'll read a little bit of Fiona's background, and very, very quickly we make some decisions about whether we would trust her to hire her at, say, our firm. The question that we're going to talk about for the rest of the day is what happens when AI is mediating this communication. So if Fiona had not actually written those words, but she had actually used ChatGPT, which many, many, many people are now doing to write that. Those signals that we were using to rely on are now mediated. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily wrong or not, carrying in information that is accurate and relevant, but they weren't produced by Fiona. So some of those things about how she spoke, what she chose to speak about, what she is actually saying, no longer generated by Fiona. They're generated by a machine. And so what happens when we encounter this? What happens when this very highly tuned, highly optimized sociocognitive system is mediated? Is it disrupted? Does it undermine trust? Or perhaps do we even trust these things more because a machine is less, biased or something like that? And that's the question we set out to go with. And I see a question from Christine there about face with expression. Actually, it's the structure of the face. So they're supposed to be both neutral, and your interpretation of A being angry is actually an interpretation, and that's sort of one of the cool things about it, not the emotion. Yeah, cool. Okay, so we set out, we worked with Airbnb. Initially, this is work with some colleagues at Cornell Tech, Maurice Jakish, who's the lead author on most of the work I'm going to show you today. He just graduated last year, amazing dissertation. He's at Germany, graduated from Cornell Tech, and his advisor is Moore Naman, who I've done most of this work with. He's been the person I have done all of the stuff on AI-mediated communication with, and amazing researcher that I encourage you to check out if you haven't heard of him before. So we looked at Airbnb profiles, and we had people judge them for how trustworthy the host seemed based on the profile. And I've showing you 10 examples here. I've lined them up from the most trustworthy P1 over to the least trustworthy P10. So each P is a profile, and on the y-axis is the degree to which they're trustworthy. We use pretty standard trustworthiness scales that are based on the degree you think that this person is benevolent, that they have good abilities, and have integrity. So those are the kind of three cores of trust that we're using. I'll give you an example of the profiles. Here's one. We own and manage several vacation rental properties. We're always readily available if you need anything at all during your stay. Seems good. My brain immediately says, yeah, that seems pretty trustworthy, and I'd rate them high, and you can see people do. The least trustworthy of the 10 I'm showing you is here now. It's I am Sharma, a simple and single guy. Monday to Friday, I like to stay busy at my work, and Saturdays and Sundays are party night, so Sharma gets rated low for trustworthiness. Part of it is, the party night comment, which is not going to be rated as trustworthy for an Airbnb host. And there's also likely out-group dispreference or racism, right? So if a white person is looking at this and someone's named Sharma, then there's likely also some trust penalties because the person seems like they're not in the in-group. So we can see by looking at these things, our brains very quickly make these decisions, even though this is text. that sort of infrastructure, cognitive infrastructure we've built is really adaptable and has moved over and able to analyze text also very quickly for trust. So what happens if we tell people that instead of Sharma or the other folks there writing it, that they had an AI system write it instead? My expectation, Moore's expectation, Maurice's expectation is that there would be some sort of disruption, that people would not trust these as much. And what we found was quite surprising to us. When we told people, hey, this was generated by an algorithm, because this was pre-ChatGPT, so people weren't really aware of these systems. So we said algorithm, and then we showed them a little demonstration of how that might work. We said this was generated by a machine based on somebody's inputs. No disruption in trust at all. As you can see, they're basically identical. And we were quite surprised. Maurice observed that we had sort of told them with some certainty, this was either written by a human or this was written by a machine. And so in some ways, perhaps it was because there was no uncertainty. Sample size for this one was about 900 people on this. And these are all drawn from Mechanical Turk. All of the studies I'll show you, and I'll specify otherwise, are M-Turkers coming in and typically making a single judgment. So they'll come in, they'll be asked some questions, they'll see a profile, and then they're asked about their trustworthiness levels, and then they're out. So Maurice had this insight of like, let's take a look at what happens if whether or not AI was involved had some uncertainty to them, whether that then leads to any disruption in trust. So to do that, we run another experiment. We're going to have a control group where there's nothing mentioned about AI, a labeled group. This was written by human, or this was written by AI. So this is what it would look like. We'd say it was generated or not. Another group in which we said this may have been written by AI, or it may have been written by a human. How trustworthy do you think it is? And another group that had some uncertainty in it, which was, do you think this was written by a machine? And then we asked them the trustworthiness question. So in these last two groups here, we're introducing some uncertainty about whether AI is sitting between them and the other person. Any other questions on the setup for the study? Okay, great. We also pre-tested profiles to see whether they seemed like they were AI-ish or not. So profiles that have like spelling mistakes or weird little things like this, hi, tended to be labeled as human, and other ones that were a bit more formulaic and formal would be viewed as more likely to be written by a machine. So here we have, hello, I'm Matthias, originally from Vienna, Austria. People would say, yeah, that could have been written by AI. And we then showed people those profiles. The ones in black that you see here are ones that were human-like in our pre-testing. So these are all the profiles were actually written by a human. The ones in orange were perceived by people in our pre-test as, yeah, these seem like they were written by a machine. So again, all written by a human. There's no difference there. The only difference is what condition they're in is their understanding of whether AI was sitting between them and the other person or not. So in the control, you can see our AI sounding ones were, rated pretty well. In the labeled condition, we replicated what we showed you in the first study, which is there's no real significant difference between them. And in the two where there's uncertainty, we see a pretty serious decline, a significant one in trust levels. So when there's some uncertainty about whether AI is sitting between you and another person in this context, we see a disruption in trust. People trust things that they suspect to be AI as less trustworthy. And this is something that Moore and Maurice and I call the replicant effect, based on one of my favorite movies, Blade Runner. This is a young Harrison Ford. He's trying to tell whether a person is a robot, a cyborg, or a human. And in the movie Blade Runner, these cyborgs are so good, you can't distinguish them unless you have special training and special equipment. and they've escaped Mars, where they were supposed to only be, and they're now at Earth. And this has led to a real dystopia, because nobody can trust anyone. You can't tell if anybody is an actual human or not. And so this replicant effect is where there's uncertainty about whether you're actually a person or not. And this then leads to decline in trust. All right, any questions so far with the study of the replicant effect? It's looking pretty good. Seeing some nods in the one room I can see with humans, so that's good. Great. Okay, so based on this work, we started to examine the decisions people were making about whether something was human or not. And again, this was based on some of Maurice's insights, looking at the work we were doing. He was noticing that there were some profiles that were being selected as human, or some that were being selected as machine more often than not. And so he was starting to ask some of our participants, like, hey, what do you think is human and what is machine? And they would say some things, but it didn't really align with what he was seeing linguistically. And so we started to get interested in the question of, well, how can people do in the GPT era in terms of telling whether something is human or not? And then more importantly, what are the things that people think are human? What are our heuristics for deciding whether something is human written or not? And then lastly, does that have implications for whether AI can be used to hack those heuristics? So we published this earlier this year. This paper came out in March. And we had about 6,000 participants do the task I'm going to give you right now. We had them do this across 3 domains: online dating, profiles, which you're going to judge right now, professional context like LinkedIn, so looking at professional profiles, and Airbnb profiles. All, as I mentioned earlier, important trust situations. You have to make really important inferences about trustworthiness based on these signals. Your job right now is a first task, not a trust task, but to decide whether you think this was written by a human or not. So we're doing a one-shot Turing test, and I'm not going to make an argument for whether the Turing test tells us whether these systems are intelligent or not. But if you're like our participants, we'll find here that you won't be able to distinguish above chance which one is human. So in the chat box, please put the letter of the profile that you think is human. So if you think that A was written by a human, an actual online dater that you could date, type in A. If you think B was written by a human, then please put in B, and we'll take a quick scan and see how we do, if we can get above chance accuracy. That's correct. So the letter you're putting in is the one you think that was written by somebody you could actually physically date. So far, it is pretty much even. Okay, so right now I'm seeing 6 A's. 10 B's. Oh, and some more A's are coming in. So we're at 9 A's, I think, and 10 B's. There's another B. So it's 11 to 9. Oh, 12, 13 to 9, I think. 13, 10. Roughly. I may have lost count. It's a little hard to do that in real time. So, oh, no, Fiona's the last one. Okay, so let's call it there. So it's 13 to 10. So pretty much chance. And in fact, you perform very much like our participants. B was in fact the human one. And you performed roughly 55-ish%. And that's roughly what we see when we asked about 6,000 participants across all of these conditions. So what I'm showing you is different contexts. You can see at the top, we've got hospitality, dating, and professional. Those are the three contexts I mentioned. The y-axis is the percentage of people that, pardon me, of profiles that were accurately identified. And on the leftmost box, this is Airbnb, and we can see that people were performing around 52%, which statistically was above chance, but effectively is the same as chance. When we look at the dating, we have two versions, one where it was just run exactly like you just did, and another one where we paid people more if they got it right, and the incentive didn't help. In the professional context, so it's similar to a LinkedIn site. We gave people also a condition where they got feedback, and then we're able to do another one, and feedback didn't help either. Overall, across all of the conditions and treatments, 51.7%. So effectively chance. So on one-shot profile assessments, and this is GPT-2 to GPT-3, the machine passes the Turing test. Now, you all were probably statistically above chance like this, but effectively also. Can we share this on social media? Can we share what? The talk, the graphs? Of course, absolutely. So we won't get into the intelligence debate, and these are from the PNAS paper. That is correct. So if you can find that, or I'm happy to send this to the organizers afterwards. Right, so we can set aside the intelligence debate for another philosophical take, but clearly the machines have passed the intelligence test in this context, and there is no difference. But what's really cool is that all of you, were able to make this decision, or at least the 23-ish of you that put your thing in, and you all have some idea of why you made that decision. Your ideas are probably not what you actually made the decision on. So what Maurice observed was that when we were asking people what they thought, those tended to, if they were to use those, it would lead to chance. So people would often say, well, I think that like if they're talking about family, that means it's a human. But when we also look at what people decided, not on what they said to us in their self-report, but when we ran NLP to say, okay, which ones are getting assessed more as AI or more as human, what Maurice noticed was that although people were performing effectively at chance, they were not performing randomly. So some profiles were being viewed as machine written more often than others. And what thank you for the actual numbers there, 57%. Great. Well, there's a question here. What were the instructions to the human writers? Were they told to not look like AI? Oh, they're actually real profiles taken from those sites. So the people that were writing these profiles were not giving any instructions at all. Yeah. So what Maurice noticed was that they weren't random. And so we ran some NLP over the ones that were being considered more AI-like and ones that were being considered more human-like. And we found that profiles that had pronouns in them, like first person singular, that had weird spellings, that had grammatical errors, that had past tense verbs, that these were more likely to be human. And so people do have heuristics for what they think is human. And sometimes they were aware of these heuristics, like they could accurately report them. And other times it was that really low level, very ancient cognitive system that I've been talking about that was performing the task and wasn't, making its decisions accessible to our consciousness. And so what Maurice was able to do, and here you can see these are some of the dimensions that Maurice identified as features that were either misaligned, that is, people thought one thing, but it was exactly the opposite, and ones that they were making judgments on, but had nothing to do with whether AI produced it or not. Are these features predicting perception or truth? So these features are basically related to whether they were accurately predicting that this was a machine written profile. So the odds ratio here is that to pick, for example, first person pronouns down there. So if there were first person pronouns, they were more likely to think that it was human. And so you could see that that was underperforming because they were saying it was human when in fact that had nothing to do with AI versus human. That is, AIs produce second person and first person pronouns just as much as humans do. With these observations, Maurice had this really incredible insight that humans have these heuristics. They're probably hardwired, and we could train an LLM to know these heuristics. So Maurice fine-tuned a model on these profiles that were more likely to be perceived as human because of these heuristics. And we then generated a bunch of new profiles. And you can see here in the bars that I've highlighted in the red circle here, these are produced by our new optimized AI. So we're using GPT-3. It's been fine-tuned on profiles that humans tend to think are human. And what you see there is that the machine is now judged as being written by a human above 60% of the time across all the context. In the professional one, you can see it's over 70%. Across the context, it's about 66% likely to be perceived as human. And so what Maurice has done is created a machine that can create human language that is viewed as more human than human language is actually viewed. And this has huge implications for a number of things, certainly around trust, as we've been talking about. And we had a lot of discussion about whether we publish these results or not. We decided to do this to alert the field to this threat in which machines will be able to identify our heuristics in various interpersonal domains. That's through its analytic capability I was telling you about. They're so powerful at, and then use those to generate language that can take advantage of those heuristics. So when we use a machine to train up on more human language, then we can create machines that can sound more human than we do. And we're showing this in a one-off presentation, so a single profile, but I don't see in the near to medium term how this will not also apply to interactions. Okay, any questions on this study so far? Great. Oh, yes, there is a question. Or maybe it was just a yes and not a question. You were only asking to classify human versus AUI, not whether it was trustworthy. Right. That is correct. So in that study, we were not examining trustworthiness. So what I'm going to put together here is this idea that I was just telling you about earlier, the replicant effect, and this. So if we take the replicant effect to be a real effect, and we've replicated it twice now, so potentially real, it's going to depend on the, now that we have a lot of societal discussion about ChatGPT, but if the replicant effect is real, and you combine this with this inability for people to detect human from machine, we have a situation in which the replicant effect should apply. So as an employer, for example, if I go on to LinkedIn, I can no longer assume that this was written by a human. I probably am likely to assume that AI was used. I think, now introduced uncertainty. That is, I can no longer tell whether this was purely written by a human. And so the replicant effect is likely to take place here. And so I'm quite pessimistic about the implications for trust in the short term. So over the next year to 3 years. And this is an unusual place for me. I'm actually a fairly optimistic person, in addition to being Canadian. And I tend to think that we as humans are quite adaptable to these, but I worry that given how foundational these heuristics are, so they're very old, very low level cognitive operations, that I'm not sure what happens here in the short term. And so I do worry about the end of trust, at least in the short term, where these interactions that we're having online via text, and as these systems develop more multimedia capabilities, as VGPT can now do, that this will undermine trust via the replicant effect because of our inability to distinguish between human and machine written text. But because I'm an optimist, I also want to focus on some of the ways in which AI can be used for good. I want to leave time for questions. So I'm just going to go over this study super quickly, and then we'll wrap up and we can get into questions. This study was done in the summer of 2021. And Elise, who I've highlighted at the top there, was a sophomore, University of Georgia, that came to visit my lab in the summertime, part of an NSF grant. And over 3 months, she did this project in which she used GPT-3, which had just come out a little bit earlier that year, to do a task. We were interested in doing something on persuasion. She wanted to do something for good. And at that time, the number one important thing facing the US was getting people vaccinated against COVID-19. And so Elise worked on using GPT-3 to create pro-vaccine messages. You can see 4 of them here. 2 were written by Elise using GPT-3. I could share the paper with you and go over the various prompts, but we created a number of prompts that then produced messages. We had it produce about 53, and she chose 10 that were the most complete, accurate, and sensible. And we compared those with 10 messages that the CDC, the Center for Disease and Control, perhaps the preeminent public health organization in the world. These messages were written by the CDC for governments around the world to use to convince their populations to get vaccinated. Your job, like in the previous one, will be to decide which was written by GPT-3 with Elise's help. There was about, for each of the prompts that Elise did with GPT-3, 5% of the words had to be edited. So they're primarily GPT-3, but with some Elise, versus the CDC professionals that were created. So select which one you think is written by a human, written by the CDC. If you think that was A, go ahead and put A. And if you think it was B, go ahead and put B. While we're doing that, I see a question here, and I don't quite understand it. So perhaps when we get into the spoken mode, you can clarify for me. All right, we've got them coming in. B, 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 B. So 4 Bs, A, 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. We got a fair bit of Bs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 Bs and 1 A. And just since we're getting close to time, so we can leave some time, I'll close it off. And you're all doing much better. B is correct. So the CDC wrote those messages GPT-3 and Elise, again, a second year, did this as an internship in our lab, wrote these other two. When we run this with large numbers of Turkers, they tend to perform at a chance, but slightly above, just like all the other data I was showing you. So there's some signal there, but effectively it's about 53, 54%. But more importantly, in this case, we're not that interested in whether people can tell if it was human or not. But instead, we asked people to judge these on the key public health domains. There are 3 of them that public health messages get judged on. And that's argument strength, argument effectiveness, and your attitude towards it. When we presented these to about 1,200 Turkers, GPT-3 was substantially and significantly stronger, more effective, and people liked them more when the participants were unvaccinated. So vaccinated participants at that point, there was no difference. And it kind of makes sense. They were, vaccinated, so they'd already made their decision. But for unvaccinated people, the audience for whom this was most important, GPT-3 was more effective. But when we ran a follow-up study in which we labeled the messages, either coming from the CDC, coming from a doctor, which was the most trusted group in 2021, or coming from GPT-3, we told people AI, we found the opposite. When they knew a message was created, whether it was created by AI or the CDC, they thought it had a weaker argument, that it was less effective and less positive. So where this leaves us is these tools, as we all know now, can be quite powerful, and that an undergrad in the course of 3 months can create these really compelling and effective messages, as compelling or more than the world's most preeminent communication organization in the public health space. And so, as with anything in any other tool, how we go about choosing to deploy them is going to be more important than the technologies themselves. As I mentioned, I'm quite worried that these systems can undermine trust in the way that I mentioned through the replicant effect, by creating uncertainty in human-to-human communication. But that isn't necessarily the case. These can also be used in ways that can enhance trust. For example, in the likelihood that you think you should get vaccinated. So also useful for tackling things that are really, really crucial in the trust space. So I'll leave it there for now and open it up for questions. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll just put this information up here so that we have it while we talk. But I'll stop sharing so I can see people's faces should they decide to turn their camera on. And thank you again for all of your attention.
Thank you for the talk. So if anyone has questions, please, can we unmute?
Christina, I can see you raised your hand. Do you want to go ahead?
Okay. Oh, good. Fine. Thanks. Great talk. This was really fascinating. I had a question actually about the replicant effect. The fact actually we as a group did better on that judgment task, human versus not human, could be the fact that we had a lot more time to get used to, familiar with these AI-generated text. So I'm going to hypothesize that increasing familiarity with AI tools is going to decrease uncertainty and will decrease the replicant effect. I wonder if you have any kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I have. That is my stance right now as well. Yeah, absolutely. I've been tracking, working with a group called Better Up, and we've been tracking trust in AI, mindsets around AI since April. And just in the last 2 months, there's been pretty serious declines in trust. And it
declines in trust, like that surprises me actually.
I know. I think it's being driven by the media. So we've been asking, okay, do you use GPT or ChatGPT or any system in any regular basis? those that are using it there's no decline in trust, and those that don't, it is. So it's really a media driven change in people's mental models, I think. Yeah, thanks. I see the Pete room has its hand up collectively. They may be unable to unmute there.
Can you hear us?
I can. Yep.
Oh, hey.
Hey.
John Gretsch.
Hey, John, how's it going?
Good, how you doing?
Good.
Question, I missed something on the replicant effect. The way you described it, another interpretation is it's just measuring dispositional distrust. So that the people who were rating the things are both more likely to see it as AI and also more likely to see them as being untrustworthy, because in that context, using an AI would presumably be seen as an untrustworthy thing. So I may have missed some of the details, because I thought you were going to combine those two parts together and show that then you could make those people flip by showing them more AI generated stuff that was tuned to look human like.
Right. Yeah. No, we when Maurice Moore and I were doing this, we weren't thinking about individual differences. So we were kind of looking at these like universal heuristics across people. In the better up data, we are finding really big differences in people's mindsets towards AI. So we've found these two dimensions of a mindset. One is like, do you feel like, you're in control, or AI is more in control? And another one about like, is this good for you and humanity, or is it bad? And so, yeah, people that feel like AI is more controlling, and people that feel like AI is going to be bad ultimately, there's just way higher levels of distrust. So yeah, in the replicant effect ones, we didn't look at sort of individual differences.
But you did have like independent third-party ratings of how trustworthy, detached from that context, you had these ratings. And so did that like push that effect around? Was it really the ambiguous ones that were being rated, or is it just certain people were just rating everything as AI?
Yeah, there was a nice, if I'm understanding you correctly, there's definitely a nice distribution of trust in actual profiles. So some are not very trustworthy and others really are. If I'm understanding your question right.
Well, I guess the question is, if it's disposition, then whether it was independently perceived as being human-like or not should not matter in some sense.
Right.
That certain people are just skeptical across the board, and that would show the same result. But if you control for and show that it interacts with actually how much it is perceived as AI, then we might believe that it's more than just these people are dispositionally untrustworthy, or unwilling to trust.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'd like to think that random assignment, worked for us there, but you're right. It'd be way better if we could take a look at what their dispositional level of trust is and then examine how they get moved around or not. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, actually, that comment, this is Reggie Hobbs. I'm the another person in the room. I'm the one who put that comment that you said that you weren't certain what that was about.
Yeah,
it's kind of related to that. And that has to do with, in this case, not the disposition of the person, but the disposition of the task. So you had three different tasks. You had the Airbnb, you had the dating site, and you had the presentation. Of those three tasks, the most sort of trust agnostic one is presentations, right? Because if you're given, it's a passive thing. It's just information. I either agree with you or don't agree with you, but there's no, it's a passive thing. I don't have to worry about things. Whereas in the dating one, I'm basically trying to decide whether or not I'm going to trust you enough to go on a date, or in the hospitality one, whether or not I'm going to trust you enough to move into your house. So I'm saying that these people will be in both of those tasks more predisposed to not trust whether it's human or AI. And so that's why I think that's probably part of the reason why for the presentation one, you had a higher for AI being human, because again, whether you're human or not, the presentation, either I agree with you or don't agree with you, but it doesn't impact it as much. You see what I'm saying? It's not, so those tasks were inherently trust-based, the first two were, saying, and that third one, not necessarily. There's not a trust thing. Where things happens is you say something I don't agree with. necessarily. Does that
If
make
I'm
sense?
understanding, when you say presentation, do you mean the professional context, like the LinkedIn context?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
That one. If I'm just informing, as opposed to trying to get something out of it, unless it was a hiring thing, I guess maybe.
Yeah, we were thinking of it from a hiring context. So you're right, like the way LinkedIn is operating now, which is sort of like, hey, here's who I am, and this is what I'm thinking, or how I'm connected to. You're right that that's much less risky from a trust point of view. But if it's from a hiring context, I'd argue it's probably one of the biggest risks, right? Because if that's how we were thinking about it. But you're right. I'd have to think back to how we framed it for people with the professional one. But typically we were just asking these, benevolence, integrity, ability questions. So you're right. That might explain why the professional context was slightly higher there. But I think that if you're thinking about should I hire this person, the trust levels are just as high. Yeah. But thank you. That's
again, if this because if this is about communication and how humans use communication, we always do it. It's the Gryson implicature stuff. We always do it for a reason, right? We're trying to inform, or we're trying to amuse, we're trying to whatever. So there's a purpose to how we're doing it, right? And so when you guys fine-tuned it with the professional stuff, you're teaching it to write like a person who's trying to hire someone or something.
Yep.
You're teaching it for a particular audience.
Yeah.
Right. So that same, that same way of writing isn't going to be successful in making you laugh, or successful in getting you to buy a car or something like that. So again, it's the purpose of the communication that is probably driving more whether they think it's humor or not. Because is it effective in making me laugh? Is it effective? In other words, those are traits you would think a human being would be very good at, and an AI system not so much. So again, that's.
No, 1,000%. But I couldn't agree with you more. I literally say that argument every day when we talk about people and media. So completely agree. But just to be clear, so we created an optimized model for each context. So there was a dating optimized model. There was a Airbnb optimized model, and right, because otherwise you're right, if we took the dating model and had it write LinkedIn profiles, it'd probably suck, right? So yeah, completely right. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the questions. Jinyi Yi, sorry if I said your name wrong.
Hi, Professor Jeff, and thanks for the presentation. And I have a general question about how you define and approach trustworthiness in an AI-mediated communication setting. I think that most of the studies that you are presenting are based on the message itself, the content of the message, and whether that message is human-like and very can argue with and how to persuade people. But I think when we are approaching message online, we're not only trusting the message itself, we're also trusting the source of the message, and whether that interaction is kind of an interpersonal interaction or a mass interaction where we are broadcasting to a lot of people. So in this setting, we don't know how much AI is involved in the real world social media setting, for example. So do you have some ideas about how to disentangle the involvement of AI in the observational data of social media?
I think I would take it even further than you. So, all of the deception detection research shows that we have a very strong truth bias towards messages. So our default is to trust it as true and not to consider that it's false or that its source is something other than who the person is. We can become suspicious, and so we can move out of that truth default state. We obviously were doing that with our participants by asking them questions around trust, or is this human or not? And so I think the degree to which people will assume something is written by a human is extremely high. And that's part of my concern, is that these are really deep human we could call it biases, right? Like a truth bias, but really it's about us like making decisions about people really quickly. And so I don't see us changing that. I think it's going to be really hard for us to say like, oh, is this, human or AI? I think we'll just, for a while at least, be thinking, no, this is, not thinking about it and just interacting as if it's a human. So people that are competent at using AI to, to do AI-mediated communication are going to have an advantage. I think they're going to do quite well. So that's, think sales, think politicians in the near term. It's certainly who I'm getting the most kind of requests for, consultations around AI on. So no, I think you make a really good point, and I think I would make it even stronger, and that is that people won't be considering whether this is AI written or not in the near term.
Thank you.
Thank you. Xiao Zhang. Yeah, hi.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Hancock. First, thank you so much for your time and sharing with us through this talk. It's really inspirational. I just have some questions while listening to it about how we perceive what other people are modifying and what's their intention in modifying their text or speech through AI. So for example, would there be a difference if someone is modifying their emotion and tones in their speech or in their text versus someone is modifying like the exact content of their speech or text? Would there be a difference in how people perceive them and how that relates to the trust?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in our paper where we kind of frame AI-mediated communication, we have a table about the different dimensions that AI can play a role. And so you've nailed, a couple of them. One is going to be, what is the optimization goal, right? Like, is it to persuade you to date me, or as we were talking about in our last conversation there, or is it, what is the goal that the optimization is trying to accomplish? And another one is magnitude. So to what degree is the AI playing a role versus like, it was mostly me and I had to, touch up my language to have more of a growth mindset or something like that. Or is it the system's generating, most of the message and I'm deciding to send it? There's a third one, which I think you were hinting at a bit, which is about my agency over the system. So we will have, LLM Jeffs that will operate on my behalf. And I could sort of say, go ahead, respond to my email in the same way that we have, we think of principal agent frameworks. So I'm a principal, I can delegate my lawyer to respond on my behalf, and they don't have to check in with me all the time. They're operating on with my interests in mind. And so I think all of these things get really, really, really interesting. In the same way that principal agent framework has been analyzed a lot in economics and politics, there's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of interest biases here. Unlike a lawyer, this machine is a machine. It's owned typically by another corporation. And so there's all kinds of interesting spaces here. And so that's a long way of saying that I don't know the answers, but there are lots of really cool empirical things to examine in this space. So thank you for asking about them.
Thank you so much.
Mithun.
Hi, hello. This is probably amazing talk. Just a random question, which is like, we are talking about trust. And so let's say you're hiring someone, you read his resume, it looks amazing, but you call him for a face-to-face interview. Then you realize, he's not who he says he is. So isn't there a solution to this problem of replicant, which is like, you can just have a face-to-face meeting. Another human should, once you put a human in front of the person, should that not be a solution for the trust issues?
Yeah, 1,000%. I think what this is likely to do, if the replicant effect is real and it scales and becomes an issue, then right, this, potentially what we're doing now, so you can actually see me in video, that's going to be good. But, as my colleague, Hani Farid has pointed out, like, it's going to be pretty easy to generate these kinds of videos too. So I think it's going to reprioritize face-to-face. I mean, online daters already know this, right? Like, there's value to texting in which you can get some initial assessment. You can do sort of like, the psychopath check, and then you meet for coffee. And so online daters are already dealing with this sort of replicant effect concern, and they solve it exactly as you said, by meeting face to face. So yeah, there'll be even more value placed on face to face interaction. Thanks. Great observation. Boonji, I think you're the last one here. So yeah, great.
Hello, finally seeing you, Dr. Hancock. You're like everywhere in my MA thesis, by the way.
Right up.
Yeah, I put my question in the chat, but actually I can just read it. So do you think the machine heuristic, like perceiving machines more credible and objective, can be applied to AI-mediated context as well? What's the significant difference in people's perception between computer-mediated, AI-mediated context? So like, and recently I feel regarding AI, people have ambivalent attitudes, because like sometimes I see some people saying that we have to replace our judge in the court as AI because like they would work better. Or like sometimes like people might feel really uncomfortable when some information is treated by AI. Like what do you think about those like differences in computer mediated context and mediated context, and like those different ambivalent people's mindset?
Yeah, well, so for the CMC AIMC distinction, I'm glad you picked up on it, because that's exactly what we were kind of like playing off of. Like my world for a long time was computer-mediated communication, so messages are being moved by machines, which was an amazing capability. And now with AI, the machines are not just moving the messages around; they're operating on them, right? But to your bigger question, it's exactly as John was asking about. So what we're seeing is that right now, what I call folk theories about AI, which is basically people's intuitive, unexamined, kind of commonsensical thinking about what a system is like AI. They're highly malleable right now. I think that people want to understand or know, but they don't really feel like they have a good grasp on what AI is, what it can do, whether it's good for them, whether it's going to work for them or against them. Is it going to take their job? Is it going to make their job easier? So it's a really incredible moment, I think, in time where I think attitudes, mindsets, folk theories, all these concepts are pretty malleable. My guess is that a lot of the corporations that are developing these models are also working on branding and positioning and communication strategy to try to, modify and push around our folk theories. So that's important. This, might be one of the most important questions. If you think of any deployment of AI in a context, like we were talking about, there's different contexts and that people have different goals in them. If I'm a company and I want to deploy AI in my service, there's this really important equation that I think most people aren't thinking about. And the equation has two sides. On one side is AI and the technological development of that system and how it operates. And on the other side of the equation is that folk theory, a person's understanding of what the system's going to do. And if the two sides of that equation are not balanced, right, if they're not aligned, then whatever the deployment is, it's likely to fail. And the failure will occur through some violation of expectations, undermining of trust. And so, in my view, the vast majority of attention and resources are being paid on to the AI side of the equation, technological development, etc. And there's much less attention on how does your user, client, customer, employee, community understand what this system is or does. And so I think you've asked sort of the core question that if you're talking to organizations that want to deploy AI, that they need to think about from a trust point of view. So thanks for that.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have a question in the chat.
Okay.
Jeff Gallery, does your research and information extend into the use of AI or machine learning for decision making? In example, approval of loans.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So technically, Maurice and Moore and Karen Levy, Malte Young and I, when we were kind of defining the bounds of AI-mediated communication, we were thinking of it as between people that were communicating with one another. And so that can be pretty broad, but if Moore was here, he would be like, no, that's a decision-making task, and that is not a communication task. And, I could push that and say, well, you're communicating about whether or not to trust somebody with a loan. But yeah, so I would say technically, and Moore would probably be right, that would fall outside of the AI-mediated communication space. But all these questions around, folk theory, around trust in a system, all those things are going to apply there. But technically, the AI/ML on like loan approval or making decisions in court about sentencing, all those questions fall outside of AIMC. But yeah, thanks. Do you want me to answer any other of the questions I'm trying to be sensitive to people's time. I appreciate everybody staying as long as they have.
Do people have more questions, like in the chat or?
Christine asked this question that I think is really complicated about like our profession. So like for the students in the room, we've been talking a lot about this up here at Stanford with my groups, and like I'm literally sitting down and writing papers for a conference called ICA, which is one of communication's main ones. And I'm like, is this the last time I sit down and write a paper like this? Like I've been doing this for 25 years, and is it done? And like, is that a bad thing? Christina asked exactly right. So most of the high level journals that I submit to now have AI disclosures in them. And I think that's a really good approach. Why would we not allow AI to be used in, for me, one of the hardest parts of our job, right? Of doing all this writing. And so my view there is that much like my syllabus, which makes rules about that community, my class, and how AI can and cannot be used, we should be deciding how these systems can be used as well. Like, I think these are our decisions to be made. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong, but we, the people, should be making these decisions and just being really clear. And then, if we say, okay, look, you can use AI, you just need to disclose how you did that, I would be excited by that. And that's certainly the rule I've set for my students when they're writing in my class. So will it matter? I think it will, but we get to decide. And the last thing I'll just say too is, I've talked to a lot of people that are ESL speakers, and I had this one guy, I was at UCLA, and he was close to tears at like how valuable GPT-4 had become for him, because he felt like he could finally communicate with his colleagues in a way that he wasn't judged for being a non-English speaker. And there's these other contexts too, where, if you're a young Black woman applying for a job, you're facing 3 biases, well-known, even quantifiable. If you were to use these systems to write more like an older white male like me, because that voice is judged more trustworthy still and is not subject to those biases, well, that person is overcoming pretty substantial barriers like racism, genderism, ageism. So she's accruing a lot of benefits, but it comes at a cost where we're sort of homogenizing language and using our kind of these heuristics, hacking them to make and prioritize one other kind of language. So the ethics on all this are really interesting and not as simple as when I first started working on this. So that's another area I'm working on, is how do you think about the ethical deployment of these systems? So once the system is built, which is what all of the AI frameworks, all the ethic frameworks, everything out of the White House, everything out of the EU are all about the development of the technologies. They're all focused on that one side of the equation. So guardrails, constitutional AI, all that stuff is based on the tech development. And there's just very little about like, okay, once you have that box, once you have that tech, and as Christina says, like you're an academic, you're going to write with it. Like, okay, well, what are the ethical frameworks? How do I make decisions about when I get to use this and do it in a way that is ethical and effective versus not? I'm a clinician. Can I use it to help me write my clinical notes? I'm a psychologist. Can I use them to help write a message to a client so that they have a more growth mindset, or it espouses positive psychology better? So there's so many ways to think that it could be used well, and then there's still so many ethical questions about whether that's, reasonable or not. So I'll end with that. It's always good to end with ethics. Thank you all so much for the attention and the great questions. John, great to see you. I only saw you as just a tiny little thing, but hopefully we see each other in 3D again soon. Thanks, everybody.